Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Grow Your Occupancy podcast. I'm Julie Podewitz, CEO and founder, and today I'm welcoming back by popular demand, Rick Shamberg. Welcome, Rick.
Hi, Julie. Great to see you again. I sort of pushed back on the popular demand thing. I think that you're just going to go to heaven for your kindness.
If you haven't watched part one or listened to it, please do. Rick is the managing director of New York-based Scarp Capital Partners. And Rick, you've been in senior living for 20 years.
20 years
now, right?
20 years this summer.
Unbelievable. And you started off, you're an investor now. You've been really worked in every capacity, almost probably in senior living. And I love that you started as a sales counselor at the community level.
I started as a sales counselor at the community level, but I really started by living in David Smith's parents' apartment at the Gatesworth in St. Louis. So I did the immersive senior living MBA 202, where I worked at a community and lived at a community simultaneously.
Well,
the community I lived in, I think, the Gatesworth to this day is one of the nicest, finest communities in the country. Both from a physical plant standpoint and a customer experience standpoint.
Well, you started at the top, right? And learned from the master, David Smith. And the Gatesworth, I've been to that community as well, as I have attended one of David's and Alex's fantastic trainings. So having a mentor.
And I think, David told me when I first met with him, when he first convinced me to come to St. Louis, he said, if you want to be successful in this business, you need to learn how to move families into senior living. And candidly, look, I had an MBA and I had, worked in tech and I had deal experience at that point. I was, a young guy, but to this day, that statement has rang and proven true more than anything else I've heard in the space. We have to understand the sort of bridge that families have to cross in order to go from circumstances that aren't working, triggers that occur, episodes that occur that have made their circumstances either as adult children or as the residents themselves, or the seniors themselves, sort of untenable, that a change has to happen, one that is incredibly challenging, that creates a tremendous amount of fear. How do we sort of reduce that fear and get these families to higher ground? Understanding that cycle has been, I think, the most important, lesson, has created the greatest value for me as, an operator, as an owner, as an investor in the space. And I really think everything starts from, look, you can only get people to move into your community if your programming is right, if your food is right, if your care is right, if your people are right. I always say the operations of a community have to support the sales effort, and if they don't, you're not going to be able to move people in. So they challenge each other. And we all, sales makes operations better, and operations enables sales to be more effective. The brochure has to match the reality.
Yeah, absolutely. In these 20 years that you've been in this business, I'm going to venture to say that what you're just talking about hasn't changed. The difficulty, the emotional difficulty of this decision, certainly people coming to us with the need, right? They're coming to us with the problems, with the concerns, with the challenges, which on the face of it, on the surface, it makes great sense, right? Well, gee, you have this problem, we have this solution, boom, we're good to go. And unless you've sat in that seat and you've talked to families and really understand the emotional difficulty, it's just hard to wrap your head around. That hasn't changed, but Rick, what would you say? And this is kind of a big question because 20 years is a long time, but maybe just the last handful of years. What have you seen change most, or kind of what trends are you seeing in the business now?
Yeah, I'm going to answer before I want to answer that. I'm going to give you, I mean, literally an hour ago, I got a call from one of my best friends from growing up, saying, we need to help my mom. You'd given me a recommendation on a community 6 months ago. We've got to do something. He and his family, they have no idea how to traverse this, right? And so he calls me, and I happen to know Venice, Florida, and I can make a good recommendation to a community in Venice. I encouraged him to not take no for an answer from his mom. In other words, she's now sort of, the fear is creeping in, and she's having a change of thought. But I said to him, I said, look, you could say no, you could band-aid the situation now, you can make the decision not to make the move, but today is when she has options. She gets to make the choice on where to live and on what conditions, she's willing to sort of, adhere to. And if you punt on this decision, you kick the can down the road, you literally will be in a much worse situation 6 months from now or a year from now. So, you gotta sort of, not take no, for an answer. And every single one of us, has to navigate this terrain at some point. All of our loved ones, each of us will get to a point where we have to make decisions that are very difficult to make. And there's always going to be a lot of fear. So understanding the psychology of that, as professionals in the space, whether we're the operator, whether we're the sales counselor, whether we're the investor, whether we're the lender, is very important. As an investor, I don't nag. I'm not asking questions of our operating partners, of our executive directors, of our sales professionals. Why isn't occupancy up? I know how hard it is to get someone to move to a community. As nice as it is, as nice as the furnishings are, as good as the food is, as attractive as the sense of arrival may be, we're building something that people absolutely don't want. It's the only real estate asset class that's like that. Apartments, office, retail. You're building something that, a business is excited to move into, a Generation Z is excited to get their first apartment, and I always tell people who are interested in being in the space, you're building or you're buying something that people absolutely don't want. And so having that understanding as an investor and as an owner is so critical. Now, it can be overcome, but it has to be overcome with a great strategy, with the right people, with the right, TLC. And as I like to say, all the wheels of the wagon have to be moving in the right direction. When you talk about troubled properties, which there are a lot of today, there's a lot of distress. Our natural tendency as an owner is to make cuts. Our occupancy is low, our debt service is high. We're making less money or we're losing money. So, where can we sort of make cuts? But we have to invest in the loss. We have to, figure out what changes need to be made from a personnel standpoint, from, where we have to invest in the physical plant. Do we have to rebrand, reposition? Do we have to, tell a new story, to our consumers, to our referral sources, to our influencers, to our residents and their loved ones. And if all the wheels are not moving in the same direction, chances are a community certainly is not going to be as successful as it's capable of. And one of the things, that I'm really seeing that's different today is, seniors' expectations and loved ones' expectations are higher. Moving into a community that offers bingo and a piano player on Friday, with a couple of choices for dinner and, sort of a bologna salami sandwich for lunch. It's not okay. It's not acceptable. So expectations have increased, and that means we have to elevate our game from a programming standpoint, from a value proposition. Here's what you get for the price that you're paying. And it has to, in my opinion, sort of exceed expectations. Number two, there's a lot of new supply. Even though we've seen a slowdown in new supply because of the pandemic, because of the lack of financing available, we've seen less starts and less deliveries of new communities. There's still a lot of options. Occupancies nationally are around 80%. So there's a lot of vacant units. So a family has choices, and there's a lot of concessions being offered. We were evaluating a portfolio where not only is there a month free being offered, as well as waiving a move-in fee. But at one of the three communities, 63% of those referrals or those move-ins were from a professional referral source. The owner basically is giving 2 months plus a move-in fee away, right? So how do we compete with that?
So when you say professional source, you mean like a paid aggregator where you
Paid
pay
search.
a fee?
Paid,
Yeah. So that,
paid referral source.
yeah.
And I'm not opining on whether that's good or bad. This isn't the venue to do that, but I have my opinions. I think a really great sales team with a really great marketing team ought to be able to create organic leads through technology, through outreach, through word of mouth, through some strategic advertising, as we kind of create the place to be, and so new supply, higher expectations.
Yeah.
We just have to be way better at what we're doing. And by the way, it's just going to become more competitive.
Right.
As more money comes into the space from the capital markets, as the senior living business grows, and people start to realize it's a really big business and it's a great business. And the demographics are, what I said about the other asset classes in real estate, there's no more compelling asset class than senior housing in terms of the demographics and the demand, right? I think on our last podcast, I talked about we have to figure out how we're going to be able to, as a society, house and care for an additional 50 million people between now and 2050.
Something must be missing. We've got 80% occupancy across the board. And so a lot of vacant units, right? And the demand increasing. You and I have been doing not exactly the same path, but we've both been in the business for almost the same amount of time. And I would agree with you that expectations are higher than ever. It's not to say we didn't work hard 20 years ago, but expectations are higher. The supply, certainly we'll talk a little bit about staffing being, because of course COVID came in and even elevated every challenge to a degree none of us can even measure yet. But what it's not to beat up on those that are working really hard and they're in the whirlwind, but there's such a gap, right, between the expectations being high and providing what people expect and the demand. Because statistically, we open up that funnel, even just 5 basis points from lead to move in. We don't have enough units. But then we also have to service and meet those expectations, which is challenging in a perfect situation. It's really challenging when you have staffing, the turnover, people no show, no call, no show, the agency, people walking off the job. I've never in my career have ever seen like walk off the job to the degree that, it's happening now. So that would be something that I've definitely seen change is that staffing. So I know there's no magic wand, Rick, but what if you could give advice? If you give advice, because you've been in the seat, you've been in the operator seat, maybe not during COVID, but what advice for
Yeah,
any of
I
us
think,
trying to do this?
before we talk about that stuff, I wanted to make staffing, which is huge, because, the experience that we're trying to create for residents and their families, we have to replicate and place just as much of a priority on the experience we're creating for associates. And I do have a few ideas as it relates to that. But one of the things that we need to do is remember, only 10% of age and income qualified seniors are currently living in senior housing, plus or minus. So that means 90% of the people either can't afford, don't want to, aren't ready, aren't willing to move to senior living. The business is still super need driven. It's sort of, I'm at my last resort for the most part. That's, not true so much in active adult. It's not as true in independent living, but it doesn't have to be that way. This can be a choice. We can make this attractive enough for people to want to move. We have to do a better job of transferring the enthusiasm that we have for our communities. When we see a resident who moved in, who was super reluctant to move in, who was driven by fear, we carried them from their home where their circumstances weren't working across that narrow bridge. We dropped them in our community. We loved them up, right? They now had, they were doing things that they once enjoyed. They were, socializing, they were eating with people. The light kind of came on, right? And then 3 months into living there, they say to us, I wish I would have done this sooner. We can do a better job of making this a choice, of transferring that enthusiasm. I talk a lot about, those prospects who decide not to move, right? Our job as owners, as an operators, sales professionals, is fill heads and beds, right? If you're not willing to move to our community, if you sort of say, no, I'm not ready yet, or, I've decided not to move, or you're no longer a customer. So what are we doing to address and engage those people who make a decision not to move? How do we stay engaged with them besides a phone call every 3 months or inviting them to an event? I call it the social membership, right? I think that there is a huge need to create social memberships for people who they want to be in our community. They want to be a quote unquote resident, but they want to live at home for a period of time. And I think there are a lot of ideas around how do you do that? If you have the place to be, you can solve for the where issue by creating a model so that people can come to the community for dining, for programming. And by the way, in order to make that attractive, we have to elevate our dining and elevate our program, make our dining room a place that you'd actually want to go have lunch if you have a choice. Make our programming, whether it be an excursion, whether it be our book club, whether it be, a Pilates class, a yoga class, make it so that they want to come there rather than, Equinox or Lifetime Fitness or, a personal trainer. But, you also expand, the top line potentially. If you can charge somebody, $495 a month for being a social member, giving them access. You solve for the where issue. And eventually they're going to realize that they're sort of missing out by going home every night.
Right.
And so that transfer of enthusiasm has to improve. And I think we are making incremental progress. But we're going to have to continue to do that. And I think increase the pace of that progress. I still go into a lot of communities that I would describe as sort of vanilla, that are still, when you look at the menu, when you look at the activities calendar, when you look at the participation and the engagement, it's still lacking. And I do think that, transitioning to the sort of the staffing issue, a lot of it is because there has been a lot of turnover.
Yeah.
There has been a lack of consistency among, the executive team at a property. I always see the best run properties are the properties that have had a team, the executive director, the sales director, the wellness director, the move-in coordinator, the director of resident services, the chef. They've been together for a few years. They know each other's cadence. The chef can jump in on a tour, the executive director, and doing a tour, or the sales director and doing a tour, tease up the chef when they come out to say hello and meet the family. They know exactly what each other's cadence is. The associates, they know what they're going to get when they walk into work every day. They know that they're going to be valued. They know that they can, if they have to take time off, that somebody else is going to step up and that they're willing to do the same. I think the labor challenges go well beyond, just our industry. Obviously, the airlines, restaurants, other food service operations, the frontline workers, this quiet quitting, which you described as sort of a no call, no show. It's pervasive throughout our economy. I was really heartened yesterday when I read about there were 40 companies that stepped up to fill 20,000 jobs with refugees from Afghanistan and Ukraine. And I couldn't help but thinking, these are major corporations that agreed to sort of do this. But I couldn't help but thinking, boy, that's exactly what our industry needs. Communities and providers stepping up to say, what, we'll hire Afghani and Ukrainian refugees to work at our communities for all the reasons that people want to hire refugees, because they're loyal, because they're humble, because they're grateful, because, they consider that job to be an honor.
Right.
So I do think our immigration policies, need to change in Washington. That would be incredibly helpful. That's not something that we control. Obviously, ASHA is doing, and the team at ASHA is doing everything in their power to try and move the needle forward on behalf of the industry to improve those policies, to make them more friendly so that we can hire the workers that we need who want to do these jobs, because they're tough jobs. They're exhaustive emotionally, physically. And there's a lot of folks, who grew up in this country who just don't want to do these jobs. And so what can we do? What's in our power to just enhance the experience for associates? It's certainly things like, offering, more flexibility and, part-time hours and, cross training, the universal worker model, which we really, when I started, we didn't really like. We didn't want somebody, cleaning our apartment as a housekeeper and then serving us lunch, a half hour later. It wasn't sort of good form. But today, this idea of universal worker has taken on new meaning and new importance because, we're short-staffed. So we just, I think it is a solution. Cross-training people, hiring somebody as a housekeeper with a real honest commitment that, there's no reason why you can't, in a year be the assistant activities director or, be our move-in coordinator or,
Right.
5
And
years from
provide
now, be
opportunity.
the 5 years from now, there's no reason why you can't be the executive director of this
Right.
company, right?
Right.
So truly painting a picture that's real for people, for promotion, for growth, I think is really, really important.
Well, I mean, when we have associates at our communities that are excited to be there, or maybe they're not excited, but they're pleased to, when they feel it there. You talked about, Rick, a team of leaders that has stayed together for handfuls of years. I can't help but think that may be one of the things that's changed most from 5-10 years ago to now. that's rare, not the case. It's usually rare. So when, we can retain great people at every level, at every, part-time housekeeper all the way through, and provide an opportunity that for growth, just a reason to stay, and really fulfill on those commitments. Again, even short-term steps to fulfill on those commitments. Stability in the communities. Why do people move? Family, feel, consistency, feel the love, all of that. I know it's probably easier said than done, but we've got to do something, right? We've got to take some steps. We've got to make some type of commitment. And to your point, opportunities on so many levels with refugees. It's opportunities for wins across the board, for the refugee, for humanity, for them, for our senior, for our business, to sustain, to grow. I mean, how many people is even in 10 years? We've been talking about boomers for 20 years, 15 years. Well, it's now starting to happen. Just the beginning of it.
2026, we are 3.5 years away from the wave of the baby boomers turning 80 and the silver tsunami starting to occur.
And how fast is that going to go? I mean,
I was sitting in a doctor's office. It was a gastroenterology office 2 weeks ago, waiting for an appointment. And I looked around and I saw roughly 30 seniors in the office, waiting for whether it was a checkup or a scope or whatever they were there for. And I was about to, right after that, I went to tour 4 communities that day with some partners in Minneapolis. And I sat there and I just sort of smiled to myself, and it occurred to me, this is what the silver tsunami looks like. I don't think even those of us who've been on the front lines in this business really understand the wave of seniors that we have to figure out how to house and care for, in our communities or in their homes. And it was, it was really interesting, just my own sort of reaction to seeing that, like, this is what it looks like, or if you go into, a breakfast spot or a coffee shop in a place like Fort Myers, Florida, or, where you just see, the aging population of our country, and just how massive it is. We have to do way more and way better at providing the amenities, the services, and accounting for the needs of not only these individuals, but their families. We're not really prepared, as an industry. We're getting better. There's a lot of groups out there that are doing things that are progressive, that are innovative, that are forward thinking, but there's still a lot of groups that are struggling. They're capital constrained. They've had a lot of turnover. They've had properties they were managing. The irony is, I use third-party operators as an example versus the owner operators. All the owner operators are susceptible to this too. If a third-party operator does a great job, they get fired, right? Owner sells the building, brings in somebody else, often, not always, but oftentimes. If they do, a subpar job, they get fired. Right. It's really, so that model of operating communities, is ripe for some change and for some innovation. I want to also point out one other thing about the labor pool. Tim Mullaney wrote an article 15 months ago in Senior Housing News, where he talked about employee ownership structures. It was a conversation that he and I had about how do we really incentivize employees to stay or employees to come? What can be a tool for attraction and retention? And actual ownership is a model that has been used across industries in the American economy over a long period of time, but it's very lightly used and utilized. Very, very few companies actually are, structured with some form of employee ownership program, whether it be an ESOP or other structure. And I have really thought about this a lot. We've talked about it at Scarp internally. And I think it's a really interesting tool, because now an employee has basically stock, and they're not going to go down the street for another 50 cents an hour. They actually have something that if they stay for 10 years or 20 years or 30 years, they actually have something to take with them. They can sell their stock. It becomes, really valuable. And if you have it and, a competitor doesn't, or if you have it and, Target doesn't, you ought to be able to attract talent and attract associates to your community or to your management company, and have a competitive advantage over somebody else. So I think that we have to be more creative about our tools for retention and attraction.
It's an interesting point. You mentioned Southwest Florida a couple times in the conversation. Venice, Florida, my second home state there. Publix supermarket, right? I don't know the exact structure, but they offer that employee ownership, right? And
I wouldn't be surprised. I'm not familiar with, I know Publix,
and
I don't know what
the
they're doing.
longevity and certainly you want to talk about customer service. You pay more, to shop there than you do maybe other places, but the service and it's a grocery store. And there's other examples, of course, of that, but that's a really interesting idea. And I think Rick, just being open to thinking, forward thinking of, okay, what might we need? We've got to do something. And there's a lot of challenges. What challenge you want to solve first or address first? And it is challenging because, the first thing is today, we have to have staffing to serve the residents we have today. We've got to get, earlier in the conversation, we've got to get sales. I think anyone listening to this from a sales side or anyone that's been on owner reporting calls would love to have you on the other line, because, the owner, and I understand the owner and the investors, like, where are the move-ins? Where, how come occupancy? You've got X number of leads. What's happening? How many hots do you have? How many leads? And we need them now. Totally get that. So with that's like, it's the urgent and important, but how much time and energy are we really focusing on the important that's going to sustain business and help us, grow into the business? Might not be urgent this minute, but it's going to be urgent in very soon, tomorrow, 3.5 years from now, which goes by like that.
Yeah. The owners who might listen to this will not love what I have to say, but look, operators, they do not want to be nagged by their owners. Our attitude is if we can't be part of the solution, if we can't roll up our sleeves, and whether it's just through brainstorming or our own ideas, we haven't done it ourselves, right? Then we shouldn't be asking. I mean, we have to ask tough questions of our operators, but we have to be prepared with either additional resources or solutions, or both. And I think operators generally, like, they value and they want their partners to have a seat at the table, but not looking over their shoulder, second guessing, questioning, nagging, why isn't this? Why isn't that? They're busy. There's so much to do, that for them to spend time, preparing additional reports or doing analysis. I think it's really
Sure.
valuable. It has to be collaborative.
Yeah,
And
Or-
you know, having sat in that seat, we really understand, you know, you know, you know, why we need a marketing report, you know, why we can't just make one up as we go along. A quarterly and an annual marketing report, it has to be done. We have to write it down so that we can measure our progress, see what we've accomplished, see what we have still yet to accomplish. You know, the importance of an executive summary every month from an ED who's met with their department heads, whose department heads have sat down and written a paragraph or two about what they accomplished that month in outreach, in sales, in dining, in programming, how many, you know, prospects, how many guests, how many, where did we go to talk about what we're doing? Thinking about that for a half hour or 40 minutes once a month as a department head, and then sitting down with an executive director and having that ED compile those reports and, you know, write their own editorial, write their own commentary and sort of pull it all together enables the leadership team of a community to, again, see, what did we do this month, you know, and where did we fall short? You know, it's a very, very simple management tool, but I'd be maybe not surprised with how many communities across the country aren't doing that. Really little simple things. And that's where sort of owners and operators can team up, looking at metrics, and conversion ratios, things like tours and home visits, et cetera. But I'd be amazed at how many people aren't doing home visits, really not doing them, and how impactful they are to the move-in process. Seeing somebody in their own environment. I love the example, on Tuesday, an 87-year-old woman and her adult daughter show up at your community for a tour and for lunch. And that morning she woke up, the 87, we'll call her Mrs. Johnson, woke up and she put on her best dress, her finest costume jewelry. She took a shower. She was excited and nervous and fearful about her daughter picking her up to go to lunch and a tour at this community. And she's lovely and she's personable and she's warm. And at the very end of the tour, 2.5 hours, three hours later, when you're walking her to her car, giving her a hug, thanking her for spending the time. And she says, wow, this was amazing. This was incredible. You have such a beautiful community. I can't wait to tell my neighbor she really needs to move. You show up at that same Mrs. Johnson's house the next day with an apple pie or sticky buns from your chef, unannounced, at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and you knock on the door, ring the doorbell, and she answers the door in her robe. And she says, oh, I'm busy, it's not a great time. You say, well, Mrs. Johnson, we just had such a lovely experience with you yesterday. We just wanted to drop off this pie or these balloons or this thank you card as an appreciation for you coming to see us. Could we just come in for a second? And she says, okay. And she lets you in, and then she offers you a seat in her living room, and you start talking and you look around and you see her in her environment, and there's unopened mail on the table, and the place hasn't been properly cleaned for a few weeks or more. And you ask her the question, you have such a beautiful home. Why would you possibly want to move? And then she tells you all the reasons why her circumstances aren't working. And you realize this woman's neighbor doesn't need to move. She needs to move, right? She's sort of dying a slow death in her own living room, without the community, without the connection, without the relationships, without the engagement that we all need, to thrive. We're missing an opportunity, as salespeople, if we're not doing that. And I realize I was once a new sales guy. Stephanie Harris took me on my very, very first home visit. And I'm like, wait a minute, we don't have an appointment, we just have to knock on the door. It's pretty scary, even if you're kind of an extrovert. But once you do it, you realize you're saving people, right? You're rescuing people. from their own circumstances that they don't even realize, that they're sort of drowning. It's that level of sort of granularity and attention to detail. And when you're replacing food servers and line staff and executive directors and you're short staffed and having to call in agency labor, and the owner hasn't really invested in new furniture, so you got some CapEx issues and your maintenance guy's out, you're playing defense. And that's what we've spent all this, in COVID, we had to do that. But we're playing so much defense that we're not playing offense. We're not thinking about our activities calendar and thinking about our menu and thinking about how we improve our closing ratios. David always likes to talk about going way deeper on less leads. There's 100 different things that that we all need to be thinking about to make a community successful, and we sort of have time for like 10 or 15 or 20 of them. So
right. Well, like you said, there are 10% or so, depending on the stat you look at, of those age and income qualified who would even consider moving, and we only, statistically speaking, move 10 to 15% of those individials.
we're all fighting over the 10%, Julie.
The 10 of the 10, right? So given your vast experience and that your involvement in almost every aspect of senior living and now as an investor, what always stands out to me, Rick, every time we talk is how empathetic you are. You're a great connector, and you are a connector of people, and I can't help but think that that's your being taught by the master of empathy and connection had to have some part to do with that, and I'm sure that's your nature too. And it just drives home that while we do need to continue to think how do we address the silver tsunami, how are we going to meet those higher expectations of our customers, how are we going to meet the demand for the supply, and looking at growing this occupancy from 80%, and getting actual rate and stopping the deals, that it really can boil down many times to bringing the pie to your prospect, or bending over to pick up the little piece of trash outside the front, saying thank you to an associate, taking a minute to listen, sitting down with a resident. It's like the solving the occupancy puzzle, which is such a huge passion of mine, that no, there's no one thing, just do this one thing and you're going to have success across the board, but it's that consistency of attention to detail, and making sure that we don't forget what really works, and that we don't forget that leaning in with empathy and understanding in everything that we do, and no matter what your position is in senior living and out, is really what matters most. Really what matters most.
What you're talking about is culture, and we all talk about culture. And I think we have to continue to talk about culture and create environments that are safe, that are empowering, where we are truly training people. People want to be trained, we're not doing them service by training them for a day or two. I mean, a lot of this stuff, these behaviors, they need to be modeled in order for it to become sort of conditioning and programming. I can't do it once or twice. I mean, the reason I think that this stuff was modeled for me by the people who came before me for months and months and months. And that's why it became part of my DNA. But we're not doing a good enough job as it relates to culture. We're not listening enough. We're talking with an ownership group about, some of their distressed properties, and sort of asked them, when was the last time you went down to the community? They use an asset manager that's sort of a layer in between. And so, we tend to go once a year, and my reaction to that was, you've got problem properties as the owner, you better be there, and you better be asking the question of not just your executive director and their team, but like line staff, interviewing them all. What's wrong here? What can we do to fix this? Right? How do we improve what we're doing? And listen, that's servant leadership. That's humility. That's the values that we want to espouse. Right? The one thing I know, we do not have all the answers. As Scarp Ridge is a year old. I mean, we've got a blank canvas. We're sort of contemplating, as we go all in the senior housing space, senior living space, what do we want to be as a company? Is it capital? Is it operations? Is it development? Is it asset management? Is it all the above? Right. But the only way you kind of come to the conclusion is by listening, by learning, by observing, by being a student of the business. None of us know where the puck is going to go. I promised you I would not use a sports analogy, but I just can't help myself. Right?
Oh my gosh.
We
Rick.
had one offline before the recording started, which I thought was pretty good. Even the best tennis players, have a coach, right? Even Rafa and Roger and Carlos now,
and Serena,
those tennis fans, and Serena,
yes.
has a
Rick,
coach.
we have run out of time. I'm going to you need to have your own show. That is what you need, because it's not you need it, we need it.
I got the looks for radio, Julie. Radio. I asked some people at the Nick conference, some young guys. I said, do you guys know what AM radio is? They're like, what? Right?
Oh my gosh, that's another discussion, another podcast discussion. I love it. I remember I remember my very first car, used Pontiac T1000. Pontiac's answer to the Chevy Chevette, 4-speed, no power steering, no power brakes. And my brother bought me an FM, because it was, had an AM radio.
You put the radio in, right?
Oh, that was it. So for those of you that don't know what we're talking about.
I remember my first 77 Olds Cutlass Supreme that we put a truck horn on. And I remember taking it to, where I grew up in Northbrook, Illinois, to the radio shop. I forget what it was called. And getting that, high fidelity stereo system put in that car.
And
circa
the back, the big,
circa like 1987, it's 1986, 87. I'm aging myself a little bit.
Oh, good stuff. All right. Well, thank you so much again. Could talk to you all day long.
Yeah, we could do it again. You know what? How about next time you have me on, I'll interview you. I'm actually much better at doing the interviewing than being the interviewee.
Oh, I did listen to you all day. But Rick Shamberg, Scarp Capital Partners.
Scarp Ridge, yes, Scarp Ridge. Scarp Ridge is a ridge in Crested Butte.
Scarp Ridge. I'm so sorry. Scarp Ridge Capital Partners. Thank you again very, very much. Thank you all for listening and joining us again for another episode of the Grow Your Occupancy podcast. Thank you so much and have a great day. Rick, once again, thanks for sharing all of your knowledge. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Julie. It's always a pleasure.